welcome to Perspective in Practice. I'm your host, Rachel Sadoff, and today we have with us Dr. Charles Liu. How are you, Charles?
I'm well. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, definitely. Well, Charles, I would love for you to just kind of start by sharing a little bit about your leadership story, because I know you kind of started, in middle school education and then kind of transitioned out of education. Um, so share with us a little bit about how your journey's been.
Yeah. So I wish that I could say that my career followed some sort of like grandmaster plan, right? Because I know for some people that's the way that works out. But honestly, for me, it's been more of almost like a series of unexpected plot twists. So I like to share because I think it's really important that I was the first person in my whole family to be born in the U.S. So come from a heavily immigrant background. Learned English as my second language, Mandarin is my first language. I was the second person in my entire family to earn a college degree, following my big brother, the first one in my whole family to earn an advanced degree. And so that alone shaped so much of my own leadership journey, right? Because when you're the first one, as you likely know, there's no roadmap. You're kind of figuring things out as you go, and oftentimes it's a lot by trial and error. So education was never really just about me. It was about also breaking barriers for my family and creating opportunities for those that are coming next. So when I got to college, I realized that it wasn't the same as belonging. That kind of pushed me into becoming an educator because I want to create that experience for future students. So thinking about the best way to create change was in the classroom at that time. But then there was kind of like a big plot twist, right? So I started noticing that beyond the classroom, how systems, policies, and institutions often weren't necessarily designed for the students that they served. So no matter how hard I worked as a teacher, like I could be there day and night, and oftentimes I was, there were larger structural forces that were really limiting the possibility for students. And so that's when I really took the approach of taking a look at shifting my work and my career from impacting individual students to changing the systems around them. So my journey was really kind of a mixture of what I would describe as accidental leadership, fueled by purpose, driven by belief that no one should be able to and have to navigate those barriers alone.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's amazing. That's amazing. I kind of took a similar route to you, except for I kind of started a little bit in corporate America, then went into education, and then kind of came back out and have been doing both. But yes, I love that the work that you're doing is impacting the systems around education, and how we can just make it more equitable for everyone. So that's
Yeah.
great. So you mentioned that leadership wasn't something you initially sought out. So how did your perspective of leadership evolve over time?
Okay, so I'll actually start this one off by saying that I was the person that actively avoided leadership. Like,
Right.
I wasn't one of those kids who ran for class president or volunteered to lead a group project or anything. In fact, it was the opposite. So, if anything, I was the one kind of hoping that someone else would step up so that I wouldn't have to. I don't know if anyone can relate to that, but I remember like back in middle school, high school, right, whenever we had those group projects that everyone kind of didn't necessarily want to do, I would always be waiting for someone else to step up. And it took a while for me to really figure out why, right? I think just kind of through time, through self-reflection, through therapy, right, you kind of figure out the root causes behind some of that. And so the why for me, and what I really came to learn as I grew into an adult, was that it really came from a fear of failure.
Yeah.
It was a fear of rejection, right? It was a fear of coming in dead last in an election and having to live with embarrassment. Like I even remember when I was in high school, folks were like, "Yeah, you should run for class president," and people even nominated me, and I withdrew because I was so afraid. Like I had this nightmare of coming dead last in the election. Like I had nightmares of getting zero votes. Um, so then things started happening, and I found myself in organizations where people recognized my work before I did.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't necessarily raise my hand for those leadership roles, but someone else would nominate me, right? And then when the room went silent, when no one else was willing to step up, I'd basically be like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So I really didn't chase leadership. I would say like leadership kind of chased me, in a sense. And then there came a time where I finally just stopped running.
Yeah.
Uh, Over time, I would say that my perception of leadership changed. You had asked that question. So I used to think, and I think part of the reason why I was so hesitant about stepping into leadership roles as well is because I used to think that it was really about power and authority and control, right? About telling people what to do. And that just wasn't something that sat right with me. Like that doesn't mesh well with my personality. It's not a part of who I am. I'm not the type of person to be like giving orders. And that just didn't feel like the type of leadership that made sense to me.
Yeah.
But I felt like that was what I thought leadership was, right? That's oftentimes what you see in the media. That's oftentimes the popular version of leadership.
Yeah.
And so, what I do love though is I love getting to know people. I love getting to serve others. I love to work towards a common mission. I like to make sure that people feel seen, heard, and valued because oftentimes when I was growing up, I didn't feel those things.
Yeah.
So that's when I realized that leadership isn't about standing up in a room in front of people. It's really about standing beside them and working alongside them. And I think that's when when I learned about, the concept of servant leadership, really being alongside folks and working towards a common mission, in that form of leadership, that's when it really sunk in with me because at the end of the day, I don't believe in leading for the sake of leading. I really lead just because I care about the mission and the cause of whatever I'm leading towards.
Yeah, I think it's so important that people understand that there's more than one style of leadership. Like a lot of people think of that kind of autocratic leadership style as like that if you want to be a leader, that's what that means. But there's so many different styles of leadership. And if people really take the time to research them and learn about them, like transformational leader, pace setter leader, democratic leader,
Right,
servant leader, all of these different styles, you don't even have to be just one of them. Like
right,
you can pair them and, be a charismatic servant leader,
right,
there's so many different styles and, as a leader, like you really the more self-discovery you do about yourself, can figure out like, hey, what kind of leader do I want to be?
right.
And then I just love how you talked about kind of that fear of failure, because I think that's a lot of people's fear is like, and what keeps them from doing a lot of things. And, a lot of that can stem from childhood. Do you have, or were you able to reflect upon like where some of that fear of failure came from?
Yeah, I think so. I think a part of it was really just my upbringing, right? With my parents, I grew up in, kind of a very traditional Taiwanese Chinese household, where perfection was it,
Yeah,
right? So, coming home with grades, it was like if it's anything below an A, it's not good enough.
yeah,
And so I think that expectation of perfection, while a lot of times it can be great, because
yeah,
I think that it sets folks up for really high expectations. And a lot of times, like, of course, you raise up to those expectations.
yeah,
So I don't want to knock that that's, something that can be really great. But I do think that for me, I'll speak for myself, that level of perfection, that expectation of perfection really hindered me from learning how to fail. And
mhm,
it wasn't actually until like, I mean, I failed in certain ways, throughout middle school, throughout high school. I think everyone does, right? But I don't think I really became comfortable with it and learned how to talk about my failures. And I had never really actually openly, like publicly failed until I became a teacher. Like that's when things really shifted for me, right?
Yeah.
So I think that that failure is so incredibly important when I work with young folks, right? And I think that's one of the things that I see with college students coming into, right? Like I worked at Hopkins, UC San Diego, University of Texas. So, you know, these schools that have challenging acceptance rates. And then whenever I work with students, a lot of them come in with like, I see so much of myself in them because they're so afraid of failure, right? They're so afraid of it. And they're afraid to ask for help because of that, right? So it's this weird catch 22
Yeah.
that essentially happens. And so what we've actually been doing at the college level has actually been providing like seminars and workshops talking about failure.
Yeah.
There's actually a great project at Stanford where folks who are, you know, really successful, famous, you know, actually talk about their failures because I don't think we talk about that enough. And I
Yeah.
think it's so important for leaders as a whole, but also for budding leaders,
Yeah.
for future generations to learn that failure is a part of the process, right? And it is okay.
Yeah. I like to look at failure as just the acronym for first attempt in learning.
Oh,
And
that's
when
good.
I work with, I didn't make it up, by the way. But when I work with some of our students, because recently this school year I've been working with a group of middle schoolers, and we do what's called instant challenges.
Yeah.
And those are just set up for them to fail and then think about, okay, what did I do this time that like resulted in like the result that I got? And then how can I improve upon that? Because a lot of times the first time they do it, like even just like something simple like a paper tower challenge, or how many airplanes can you make that look similar in a set amount of time. I just noticed that some of my students, they were like so slow. Like it's like I'm
Yeah.
like, this is a race, people. But they were like so afraid to fail and do it wrong that they were like go. I was like, if
Yeah.
you go any slower, you're going backwards, man.
Right. Yeah. 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 100%.
And just to think about it, because I talked to their, principal later, and it was like, they're just afraid to fail in this environment.
Right.
You put them in a different environment, like on a basketball court or on a football field, like they are super competitive.
Right.
But in certain environments, like people just, especially in education,
Yeah.
uh, people are just so afraid to fail, which is such an interesting thing.
Sure.
And, for everybody that's listening to this, I encourage you to like reflect on like what is your relationship with failure?
Yeah. Actually, can I share a really quick story about that? So, I founded a scholarship program, right, for first generation college sophomores and juniors. Part of the reason why we started this was because we found that so much of the support goes to high school seniors and that transition into college, but there's not so much support for folks after they get in, right? So like what happens as they're preparing for the job market or what happens as they're preparing for grad school? There tends to be you know, kind of like a decrease of support
Yeah,
for students as they're figuring that out and navigating that.
yeah,
And so, one of the questions that we actually had because of this particular issue was we wanted to see how folks reacted to failure, right? Because there's something about that resilience piece, right? Like that piece of like, okay, you failed. How do you get back up? What lessons do you learn? And are you, you know, do you have the self-awareness to be
yeah,
able to figure out how to navigate that and move forward? And what we found, so it was that question that was basically like, tell us about a time that you failed, right? And what did you learn from it? And what has shocked us was that, like, I kid you not, maybe like 80 to 90% of the responses for that particular statement. So there were like five statements.
yeah.
For that statement in particular, you could tell like for all the other statements, you could tell their voices were coming through. But for that one about failure, people would like talk around it. Like no one would actually just say like, yeah, like I failed at this, right? It was almost like, oh, this happened, but it was because of like X, Y, and Z beyond my control, right? And I'm like,
Yes.
well, that's not really failure, right? Like, I mean, it is, but it's not. There's something about like I did something wrong, or that like I should have known this, or like in retrospect, right? Like I learned this. And so
Yeah.
it was really interesting about that. There's just something about you being able to, all of us, right? Being able to kind of own what
Yes.
that failure looks like. Like, yo, it's okay to mess up.
Yeah.
It happens. Trust me, I've had my fair share. And I think normalizing what that means and how to communicate about it in a productive way is so incredibly important.
Yes, I just find a lot of people do like this blame shifting. And
Yes.
so instead of owning what your actions were in it, they're like, well, if this person or this thing would have happened differently, then my results would have been differently. And
Right.
that goes really a lot back to like teamwork and like what
Yep.
people talk about is, when people are in it when like it's easy when it comes to teamwork, but as soon as people think that the ideal result might not happen,
Right.
then suddenly everybody's out for themselves, everybody's like blame shifting in different directions. And it just becomes this completely different dynamic.
100%. That's right.
So in your experience just working at Hopkins and the NIH, what challenges do Asian Americans face when it comes to representation and leadership?
Yeah. Okay, so so let me put it this way. And I'm laughing, but it's not funny, right? Like
Yeah.
I in every since I've graduated with my doctorate, in every room that I've been in, every organization, in every institution that I've been at, I have known every other Asian senior leader at my institution. Like we know each other because there's so few of us. So even in places like you had mentioned, like the NIH or Hopkins, right? I think people think of these folks like they don't think about representation in these area because let's be honest, like there's plenty of Asian scientists, professors, researchers. Um, so I think that folks think that we're well represented. But then what happens is that when you get into those rooms where those higher decisions are being made, representation just drops drastically. Um, so it really hit me. I'll actually go and share a quick story. It hit me. I just turned like 30, right? Like I actually just gotten my doctorate. And I was a director at the University of Texas. And someone casually mentioned to me, they're like, hey, hey, Charles, like, you're one of the five highest ranked Asians at the university. And I was like, wait, I'm at the director level, right? Like, I just got my doctorate. Like, how is this possible? And then, so I actually like did little bit of digging. Again, there's like a lot of professors, but
Yeah.
in terms of like folks who are making policy decisions, folks that are in rooms that are shaping, things that are coming out at kind of like a larger level beyond, right? Like your individual lab or your classroom. Um, I realized that it was unfortunately true.
Yeah.
And the same pattern has followed me at every single institution that I've been a part of. So whether it's been NIH, UC San Diego, Hopkins. And so it actually got to the point where at one of my institutions, a few of us started organizing an Asian lunch. Like we would literally put Asian lunch on our calendars. And I remember like, one of the other leaders, his assistant, saw the calendar and was like, "What's Asian lunch? Like, what's going on here?" Right? And like, what is this? Like, I've never heard of this. And it was literally just like an unofficial name for us to get together to talk about things that we were going through,
Yeah.
as Asian
Like your
leaders.
unofficial ERG.
Exactly. Yes, that's a perfect way of putting it. But it was really important, right? Because we needed kind of like that space to connect because oftentimes like we were dealing with issues or we were in positions where a lot of times we felt invisible. And so some of you may have heard of like the bamboo ceiling.
Yeah.
That's where, Asian professionals are oftentimes like highly skilled, they're technically skilled, they're hardworking, but oftentimes they're not seen as leaders. And
Mhm.
so what you see as a result of what I just talked about is a visual and kind of like an experience of that, but the concept is the bamboo ceiling. Like we're told that we're great team players, but we're not the ones that necessarily set the vision.
Yeah. So
Um,
what do you feel like Asian professionals need to do differently? Or what did you do differently to be seen as a leader, not just a subject matter expert?
yeah. So I think oftentimes what happens is that folks are afraid to speak up, right? So again, I'll speak to my own personal story. Like I was very much so kind of groomed in an environment where it's like you do what you're told, you put your head down, you work really hard, and then like these opportunities will just come to you.
Mhm.
And I think, again, I don't want to negate the aspect of working hard, having a good work ethic, because
Yeah.
absolutely, right? Like, I think that that is crucial to be able to be in leadership positions and to have doors open to you. However, I do think that there is a part of it where you have to rock the boat a little bit, right? So, like, oftentimes I would be in these rooms where, like, folks would say certain things, or there would be decisions that were made or about to be made by leaders where, like, I knew other people did not think it was a good decision. Like, we've talked
Yeah.
about it behind the scenes, we've had like side conversations about it, but like no one was willing to say it to leadership, right? And then so as part of like what I've learned, and I was just mentored in a certain way where like I learned through my mentors how to deliver that message in a professional way, in a way that doesn't make, folks in higher leadership positions feel like I'm trying to attack them or purposefully criticize them. Um, so something as simple as if you have feedback, right? Rather than just like sitting there and providing like the criticism or the feedback, um, actually come to that meeting, come to that discussion with something to do, right? So rather than just like saying like, oh, I don't like X, Y, and Z, because that just comes off as complaining, it's like, well, there's issues with X, Y, and Z, but this is what I would recommend to do about it.
Yeah.
Like this is what based off of the feedback, based off of the data, based off of whatever, these are actionable steps. And I've just found that framing has made all the difference for me.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I I agree with you that like mentors and sponsors are such a crucial piece of like helping somebody move around an organization and just be seen differently and then, like helping you acquire different skill sets to help you be seen in rooms differently. How did you go about finding mentors to support your career journey? Or did they
Oh.
find you? Or how did you find sponsors? Or did they find you? How did that go for you?
Yeah. Um, so I'll actually back up a little bit and and say something that I was told that I didn't believe at the time, but really kind of became true. I had a mentor, a sponsor. It was my boss while I was a graduate student. And then also when I graduated, her name was Dr. Eileen Bumphis. And she said to me at the time I was like a grad student, right? So I was like in my like late 20s. She said, Charles, I just want you to know that after you land your first job, or like even before that, depending on your circumstance, at some point, you'll never really have to seek out a job again. Like these opportunities will come to you because you do good work, you get along with people, you play well in the sandbox, right? That was one of the things that we always talked about was playing nicely in the sandbox with other people. Um, like going back to right like your your advice given to you as kids, right? It's so applicable as adults. um and so at that time I really didn't believe it, right? But looking back, that turned out to be 100% true. Every career opportunity that I've had, I've been lucky enough, privileged enough. um every promotion that I've had, every leadership role, it really came from a sponsor or a mentor that advocated for me, right? And of course, sponsors are different from mentors because they put your names in conversations where they might not have been.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's something that has really happened for me. So I've been really privileged where, of course, I've had to go apply and go through the process, but like my name was put forth in front of decision-making people to be able to provide me with those opportunities for every career pivot that I've done. Um, So what I will say too about like finding mentors, and I say this to my students all the time because a lot of these mentorship programs oftentimes emphasize pairing folks based on shared identities, right? So for example, right, like you'll have like a Black male mentoring program specifically focused on Black males, or like, someone knows that you're like part of the LGBTQ community. So they're like, oh, hey, there's this other LGBTQ person. Like, go ahead and like do your thing and like mentor. And don't get me wrong, I think that those relationships can be really valuable. But again, in my own career, I've had a few people that have looked like me, that have identified with the way that I identify, who have, put me in positions for sponsorship. But many of the people that have sponsored me, like I had very little to no like overlap in identity, right? So a lot of times like my champions weren't Asian, didn't come from my background necessarily, but they still recognize my work ethic. They recognize my potential, my ability to lead. And so I would say that that's like one of the things that's key to sponsorship is like be open, like don't close yourself off to who could really advocate for you. Because I see this happening a lot, unfortunately, where folks, kind of get into like those identity politics of it. And like my biggest advice and what I've done for myself is to be really open to folks that are willing to lend that hand.
Well, I think sometimes with the identity piece, it's people go there because it's safe.
Right.
And when you're looking for mentorship and sponsorship, you're really should be looking for something outside of the box, looking for somebody that has a skill that you don't have that can teach you something new and like puts you in those like unsafe, not in a bad way,
Yeah.
that like push you outside of your box, push you to grow and learn in a different way. Like even just for myself, like I'm kind of like you. Most of my mentors have not been Asian American people. Like most of my mentors have been, people of color or, even Caucasian people, men, women, all kinds of, different career paths, different skill sets, different things like that. And it was just recently, like within the last 6 months, that I have found my first like Asian female mentor.
Yeah.
And it was just one of those time and place things of like, she's in a place where she understands things that are going on in my life and in business and career as an Asian woman. And so it was in the purposeful piece
Right.
that she was brought into that circle for me, as opposed to, oh, I'm just going to you because you look like me type
Right.
thing.
Yeah. A
So,
hundred percent. Yeah.
yeah.
I think those identities, right? Like that commonality of identity can can be really beneficial. I think the fit still has to be there, right? Like with what you were saying. But also I do think that at different points in your career, right? Like it can look different. So for example, if you're, in college, that mentorship will look different when you're like in entry level or early career to like mid level to when you're the senior level, right? And then also part of the issue too is like I was talking what I was talking about before, when you get into senior level positions, like there are not a lot of other Asians,
Yeah.
right? So then it's like, kind of going back to like looping back into like where we first started this conversation, a lot of times like we are the first or like you have to be the first.
Yeah.
And then I think that's where like the importance of looking back, right? And making sure that the door is open for other folks to come through
Absolutely.
is extremely and critically important.
Yeah, absolutely. So you shared that your first like career experience was in teaching and you shared with me in the past you had, a tough teaching experience where you planned a 15-minute session
Yeah.
and wrapped it up in 3 minutes. But it sounds like it taught you a lot about resilience. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I talked about this a little bit towards the beginning, but so like you were saying, basically like my first task as a teacher, this was when I was going through teacher boot camp, if you will, was we planned a 45-minute lesson with three people, right? So I was one of the three. So each of us was supposed to teach, plan and teach a 15-minute segment. So I'd planned a 15-minute segment, as did my partner teachers. And I will say that at that point in my life, I was terrified of public speaking. I mean, I still am to a certain extent today. Like, I don't know if like anyone ever just like completely gets over it. But at that point, like I was terrified of getting in front of a group of folks and talking, which is ironic that I became a teacher, right? Uh, and so I ended up delivering that 15-minute lesson. I had it planned in 3 minutes. I was babbling. I was just like talking super quickly because, to be honest, again, in a moment of self-reflection, I just wanted it to be over. I really did. And so in that instance, it felt like 15 minutes to me. But then when I looked up at the clock, I was like, oh my gosh, it's been 3 minutes. Like, what am I going to do? And so in that particular instance, I was lucky enough to have had partner teachers that basically swooped in and helped me out, right? So they kind of came in, they had ideas, and they essentially started implementing it. So I assisted them with it.
Yeah.
But what I will say about resilience is, and I talked about this earlier, I had not really publicly failed. Like I'd failed, right?
Mhm.
Like I had not done well on a test or a homework assignment or whatever. But that was something that like you get, right? And I looked at it and I was like, oh, okay, like I failed. It was just with me. That was the first time where I failed in front of like a lot of people, right? It was like 30, 12-year-olds who are already super judgy and don't like
Oh
me.
yeah. There's judges.
Um, my partner teachers, there was my supervisor in the room. There was like it was a handful of people that had watched me just publicly fall on my face. And so as part of that boot camp, it was basically like a month and a half long journey
Yeah.
where every day I failed
Yeah.
publicly.
Yeah.
And I will actually say, like, and this might sound really weird, but it's something that in a certain way I would almost recommend for folks because there's something about failing publicly that really forces you to like get up from your behind and become resilient and figure it out and just get up and do a better job the next day. So that was literally my life for about 45 days.
Yeah.
Was I failed every single day. Sometimes it got better. A
Yeah.
lot of times it didn't, right? And so um the process of just failing, sitting with that failure, reflecting, thinking through, okay, this is what I did, this is what happened, and what were those connections, and like if I did this differently, could it have come up with a different outcome? That whole process, day in and day out, for that month and a half, was probably the best lesson that I've ever learned in my life. And I'll say that even today in my career, I go back to that time when I was 21 going through this teacher boot camp, and I have never worked as hard in any of my jobs, but I've also, to a certain extent, maybe have not learned as quickly as I did during that boot camp.
Yeah, yeah. Self-reflection is so important, no matter how people do it, whether you do it on a run, a drive, sitting in the bathtub, but just like
Yeah.
asking yourself, what did I do well today? What was my biggest challenge? And what's an opportunity for improvement? And I think a lot of people are so hard on themselves, like, oh, I have to be perfect tomorrow, so I need to change 400 things.
Right.
Like, what is that one small incremental thing that you can change that could radically impact like how the outcomes that you have the next time you do it?
Yes, I will say that I think that's one of the biggest adjustments that I've made, not only for myself, but also when I lead, like when I'm providing feedback to like folks that I do lead, right? Or folks that report to me, is that in my early career, so during that time, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I messed up this. And like I would try to implement all these changes at one time. And then because I was trying to do so much, like none of it actually really worked, right? And so I think
Remember it all.
yeah, exactly. And so I think as I've gotten, a little bit more seasoned in my career, I've learned to like do two, three max of things that I would change and do differently because then it can actually be actionable or even one, like you were saying. And before, I think as when I was early on in managing, and providing feedback to folks, I'd be like, yeah, like I would change like all these things, and folks just got overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So nowadays, certainly, and I actually have to, right, like now that I'm kind of managing through layers, right, like I manage people who manage other people who manage other people. Like that's actually one of the biggest feedbacks that I give to new managers is to make sure that you don't overwhelm your staff.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then just having the staff like kind of quantify, I think, too, a little bit. Like, am I getting better over time?
Sure.
Is it just lip service that I'm telling people? Do I actually believe that I'm going to do it, the next time? And then just, measuring those successes, because a big portion of like continuing to do something is looking at the quantity of improvement you've made thus far, even if it's just small incremental things that you're doing every day. And then suddenly you're like, you look back and you're like, man,
Yeah,
a month ago, this was so hard. And
right.
now, like, I have other challenges, but like that one doesn't seem nearly as bad as it was.
Yeah.
So, what advice would you give to leaders? Like, you know, especially, I love your idea that you kind of shared earlier about what you did for like Asian lunch, since like ERGs are kind of, for a lot of organizations, not becoming a thing anymore,
Sure.
and being closed and canceled. So I love like that advice, especially for like people trying to build community and that need that community to feel safe in the workplace. But what other advice do you just have for leaders in this kind of weird climate that we're in?
Yeah, so I think the advice that I would have for leaders in this particular climate is to really focus on what folks want, right? Like what are people wanting? What are folks needing? And I think at the end of the day, people really are craving that type of community. And so, yeah, back to like the Asian lunch idea, it was not any sort of like a formal thing. It was just I got a chance to know, like, right, like because there's so few of us in these rooms. I'd be like, oh yeah, like I saw so and so, and then another room, it'd be like, oh, I saw so and so. Like, do we know each other? Like, do you all know each other? Like, let's get together and just be in community, right? And so I think that that is so vitally important, and I think is particularly in this landscape, things don't necessarily have to be formal, right? It's okay for things to be informal, but for the work to still continue. And then I would also say, like the policies are changing like all the time now. So just make sure that you
Every
keep up.
morning you wake up.
Exactly. And so, just I learned pretty early on in my career, particularly as I was getting into these larger scale decisions. So depending on kind of like what level of leadership you're at, become very good friends with your general counsel, with your folks at OGC, with your folks kind of like on the legal side. And we would pitch stuff to them all the time, like, hey, like we'd like to do this. This is the ultimate goal of it. How can we do this in a way that is that's legal and that doesn't necessarily kind of go against any sort of institutional policy. But again, I think these types of informal touch points and get-togethers, that's something that I don't see any sort of law being able to prohibit
Yeah.
at this time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Charles, for sharing your journey and your leadership insights. It's been a pleasure hearing about your experiences and the lessons you've learned along the way. And for our viewers, if you enjoyed hearing Charles' insights today, don't miss other Break the Norm leadership interviews. And if your organization is interested in learning about how Break the Norm leadership can help you develop your greatest asset, your people, click the link below. Thanks so much, Charles, for just sharing today.
Appreciate it. Thank you.